They said the women of Rose Chapel prayed louder than the bells that crowned its tower. Their voices rose in unison each dusk, weaving through the fog that clung to Brackley-on Hill like a second skin. Theirs were not the prayers of the hopeful, nor the joyful. They were prayers sharpened by loss, pressed from throats that had already wept dry. 19 widows, 19 black-clad figures, bound by the same quiet tragedy. Husbands buried beneath unmarked soil, sons claimed by far-off wars that sent back no bodies. They lived in narrow stone houses with windows that seldom opened, and eyes that watched but did not speak. It was said that if the hunger of winter did not take you, grief would. And so they prayed, not to banish grief, but to live with it, to carry it without breaking. On the final night of October, the air turned strange, not cold exactly, but heavy, as if the sky were a low ceiling pressing down upon the town. The river ran sluggish and dark. Even the crows that haunted the graveyard kept to their roosts. When the chapel bell tolled for evening prayers, the 19 women gathered. Their faces were pale in the gaslight, eyes shadowed beneath the rims of their veils. Some moved with a slow, deliberate grace, others with a stiffness, as if walking into something they had no wish to meet. Father Elric, the chapel's priest, stood at the door to greet them, a tall man, narrow in the shoulders, his features almost too symmetrical, the kind of face you looked at twice, wondering why it unsettled you. He had been in Brackley less than a year, replacing the old rector who had died suddenly in the pulpit. He was courteous, almost overly so, yet people spoke of a strange stillness about him, as if his presence quieted a room in a way that was not always comfortable. The widows passed him one by one, offering faint nods, their gloved hands brushing the cold iron handle of the chapel door. Inside, the candles burned low, the air rich with myrrh. The sound of the door closing echoed far too loudly in the nave. No one saw them again. At dawn, the bell did not toll. The milkman, passing by, noticed the chapel doors still closed and the windows dim. He thought little of it until noon, when the market woman arrived to clean the altar cloth and found the doors still locked. She fetched the verger, who fetched the blacksmith to force the iron latch. The door opened easily, too easily, as if it had never been locked at all. The nave was empty. The pews stood neatly in their rows, the hymnals stacked, but the air was strange thick, and carried the faint metallic tang of blood, though there was none to be seen. Every candle had burned down to a stump, yet the wax lay in shapes that defied reason, curled upward, hardened into spirals, as if pulled against gravity. The altar cloth was damp, smelling faintly of the sea, though Brackley was miles from the coast. A trail of moisture led from the pulpit toward the rear wall and stopped abruptly at bare stone. The women were gone, all 19. The town gathered outside, voices low and faces pale. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Some whispered that perhaps the women had been taken, though by whom, or for what reason, no one dared to say aloud. Others claimed they had left of their own will, to join some pilgrimage beyond mortal sight. But Lydia Finch did not believe either. Her mother, Margaret Finch, had been among the 19. A quiet woman, neither devout nor faithless, but steady, the kind of person who rose before the sun to sweep the hearth and feed the hens, who never missed a prayer out of habit more than belief. Lydia had kissed her cheek the night before, tasted the faint trace of tea on her lips, and thought nothing of it. She had no idea it would be the last time. By the second day, something unspoken began to stir in the town. The widows' houses stood empty, their shutters closed. Their names began to vanish from casual speech, not out of disrespect, but as if the weight of saying them might summon something no one wanted to see. On the third day, the river turned the color of rust. Children were kept indoors. The chapel remained open, though few dared enter. Father Elric said little in his sermons, speaking instead in veiled phrases about the passage of the faithful and a calling beyond our knowing. Lydia found his calmness unbearable. At night, she lay awake listening to the wind scrape along the shutters, hearing in it something like voices, low, overlapping murmurs that she could never quite make out. On the 6th day, she stood outside Rose Chapel at dusk. The setting sun cast its tower into silhouette, the bell silent. The stone steps felt cold even through her boots. She thought of her mother, of the life she had led in this narrow place, of the loneliness she had carried quietly. And she wondered, not for the first time, if her mother had gone willingly into that night, or if something inside Rose Chapel had reached out and taken her. Asterisk, if you were in Lydia's place, standing before those silent doors, would you knock, or would you turn away, knowing what might answer? It was the tolling that woke them, not the steady rhythm of the morning bell, but 3 slow, deliberate notes that rolled across the sleeping town like a warning. In Brackley-on-Hill, such a sound in the dead of night was a thing to rouse even the heaviest sleeper. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open, yet no one stepped into the streets. They all knew what night it was. 19 widows, each draped in black, had entered Rose Chapel at dusk. They had done so without ceremony, without chatter, without the faintest glance toward the curious eyes that followed them. To those who watched from their windows, the procession was like a ribbon of shadow winding toward the chapel steps. At their head walked Father Elric. His arrival in the parish the previous spring had been quiet, unmarked by fanfare, yet it had drawn whispers from the start. He was a man who seemed built from stillness, tall, pale, and composed, with a voice that never rose and an expression that never quite shifted from solemn watchfulness. Some found his presence soothing, others called it unnatural. He had stepped into the place of the old rector, who had collapsed mid-sermon and been buried within the week. For months, Father Elric had kept mostly to himself, visiting the sick, when asked, tending the chapel's grounds, and leading sermons so measured they felt almost like recitations. But those who lingered near the church in the evenings claimed to hear voices. Long after the pews had emptied, women's voices, low and rhythmic, speaking words that did not match any hymn in the parish's worn books. The widows, too, had grown closer to him in those months. They began to gather more often at the chapel, not just for Mass, but for something else, something never spoken of openly. Each of them had been marked by loss, but theirs was a loss that seemed to carry a heavier shadow, as if grief had hollowed out a space that nothing could fill. That night, October's last, they entered the chapel as the wind began to rise. No one saw them again. By dawn, the chapel doors were shut. No candlelight glowed from within. The bell was silent. It was nearly noon before anyone dared go to see what had become of them. The blacksmith, summoned to force the latch, found it unnecessary. The door swung inward with barely a push. Inside, the air was wrong. It clung to the skin, damp and metallic, like the breath of a place long sealed underground. The faint scent of burnt myrrh lingered, though no incense sticks smoldered. The pews were neatly in place, the hymnals stacked, but every candle had melted in a way that made the onlookers draw back. The wax had flowed upward, branching like roots climbing toward the ceiling. The altar cloth was wet, the moisture darkening the fabric. When the market woman touched it, the smell rose sharp and briny, unmistakable. Seawater. Brackley was 12 miles from the nearest shore, and there was no sign of the 19 women. No discarded shoes, no abandoned shawls, no signs of departure, only absence, clean and complete. Word spread quickly. The townsfolk gathered outside, muttering in low voices. Some insisted the widows had left under cover of night, spirited, away for some pilgrimage or retreat. Others whispered of older things, of the chapel's foundations, laid upon the ruins of something that had stood there centuries before. A place spoken of in the oldest family tales as the binding ground. Among the watchers was Lydia Finch. At 24, Lydia was Brackley's schoolteacher. Known for her steady hand and her quiet way with children, she had lived with her mother, Margaret, since her father's passing 5 years earlier. Her mother had been a widow among the 19, a practical woman, not easily given to superstition, though she attended Mass as regularly as she mended the linens and tended the small garden at the back of their stone cottage. Lydia had kissed her mother's cheek the evening before, the faint warmth of tea still on her breath. She had asked no questions about the vigil. It was, after all, not unusual for the widows to pray together, and had gone to bed with no thought that the next morning would come without her. But the morning had come, and Margaret Finch was gone. By the second day, the unease had settled over Brackley like a damp fog. The widows' cottages stood dark and shuttered. Their absence was a gap in the fabric of the town. Not a torn seam, but one neatly excised, as if someone had cut the cloth clean. People spoke less of them with each passing hour, as though their names might carry some contagion. On the morning of the third day, the river turned the color of rust. The change was sudden. Its surface, usually quick and bright under the autumn light, now rolled sluggish and opaque, carrying with it the faint smell of iron. Children were kept indoors. The chapel remained open, though few dared enter. Father Elric said little in his sermons, speaking instead in veiled phrases about the passage of the faithful and a calling beyond our knowing. Lydia found his calmness unbearable. At night, she lay awake listening to the wind scrape along the shutters, hearing in it something like voices, low, overlapping murmurs that she could never quite make out. On the sixth day, she stood outside Rose Chapel at dusk. The setting sun cast its tower into silhouette, the bell silent. The stone steps felt cold even through her boots. She thought of her mother, of the life she had led in this narrow place, of the loneliness she had carried quietly, and she wondered, not for the first time, if her mother had gone willingly into that night, or if something inside Rose Chapel had reached out and taken her. If you were in Lydia's place, standing before those silent doors, would you knock, or would you turn away, knowing what might answer? It was the tolling that woke them, not the steady rhythm of the morning bell, but three slow, deliberate notes that rolled across the sleeping town like a warning. In Brackley-on-Hill, such a sound in the dead of night was a thing to rouse even the heaviest sleeper. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open, yet no one stepped into the streets. They all knew what night it was. 19 widows, each draped in black, had entered Rose Chapel at dusk. They had done so without ceremony, without chatter, without the faintest glance toward the curious eyes that followed them. To those who watched from their windows, the procession was like a ribbon of shadow winding toward the chapel steps. At their head walked Father Elric. His arrival in the parish the previous spring had been quiet, unmarked by fanfare, yet it had drawn whispers from the start. He was a man who seemed built from stillness, tall, pale, and composed, with a voice that never rose and an expression that never quite shifted from solemn watchfulness. Some found his presence soothing, others called it unnatural. He had stepped into the place of the old rector, who had collapsed mid-sermon and been buried within the week. For months, Father Elric had kept mostly to himself, visiting the sick, when asked, tending the chapel's grounds, and leading sermons so measured they felt almost like recitations. But those who lingered near the church in the evenings claimed to hear voices. Long after the pews had emptied, women's voices, low and rhythmic, speaking words that did not match any hymn in the parish's worn books. The widows, too, had grown closer to him in those months. They began to gather more often at the chapel, not just for Mass, but for something else, something never spoken of openly. Each of them had been marked by loss, but theirs was a loss that seemed to carry a heavier shadow, as if grief had hollowed out a space that nothing could fill. That night, October's last, they entered the chapel as the wind began to rise. No one saw them again. By dawn, the chapel doors were shut. No candlelight glowed from within. The bell was silent. It was nearly noon before anyone dared go to see what had become of them. The blacksmith, summoned to force the latch, found it unnecessary. The door swung inward with barely a push. Inside, the air was wrong. It clung to the skin, damp and metallic, like the breath of a place long sealed underground. The faint scent of burnt myrrh lingered, though no incense sticks smoldered. The pews were neatly in place, the hymnals stacked, but every candle had melted in a way that made the onlookers draw back. The wax had flowed upward, branching like roots climbing toward the ceiling. The altar cloth was wet, the moisture darkening the fabric. When the market woman touched it, the smell rose sharp and briny, unmistakable. Seawater. Brackley was 12 miles from the nearest shore, and there was no sign of the 19 women. No discarded shoes, no abandoned shawls, no signs of departure, only absence, clean and complete. Word spread quickly. The townsfolk gathered outside, muttering in low voices. Some insisted the widows had left under cover of night, spirited, away for some pilgrimage or retreat. Others whispered of older things, of the chapel's foundations, laid upon the ruins of something that had stood there centuries before. a place spoken of in the oldest family tales as the binding ground. Among the watchers was Lydia Finch. At 24, Lydia was Brackley's schoolteacher. Known for her steady hand and her quiet way with children, she had lived with her mother, Margaret, since her father's passing 5 years earlier. Her mother had been a widow among the 19, a practical woman, not easily given to superstition. Though she attended Mass as regularly as she mended the linens and tended the small garden at the back of their stone cottage, Lydia had kissed her mother's cheek the evening before, the faint warmth of tea still on her breath. She had asked no questions about the vigil. It was, after all, not unusual for the widows to pray together, and had gone to bed with no thought that the next morning would come without her. But the morning had come, and Margaret Finch was gone. By the second day, the unease had settled over Brackley like a damp fog. The widows' cottages stood dark and shuttered. Their absence was a gap in the fabric of the town, not a torn seam, but one neatly excised, as if someone had cut the cloth clean. People spoke less of them with each passing hour, as though their names might carry some contagion. On the morning of the third day, the river turned the color of rust. The change was sudden. Its surface, usually quick and bright under the autumn light, now rolled sluggish and opaque, carrying with it the faint smell of iron. Children were kept indoors. Livestock balked at being led to the water. That evening, Lydia walked to Rose Chapel. The sun was setting, the last of its light catching on the tower's weathered stones. The bell rope hung still. She stepped up to the door and laid her hand on the iron handle. It was cold, far colder than the air around her, and a faint vibration seemed to hum through it, like the last dying tone of a struck bell. She pushed, but the door did not move. From somewhere deep inside, a sound drifted. Not music, not speech, but something between the two, low and slow, like a chant heard from a great distance. She could not tell if it came from beneath the floor or high in the rafters. When she pulled her hand back, the sound stopped. Lydia stood for a long moment on the chapel steps, her breath clouding in the cooling air. She thought of her mother, of the life they had lived together in quiet routine, of the unspoken things that perhaps every daughter leaves unsaid to her mother, thinking there will always be more time. And she wondered, as the shadows deepened around her, whether her mother had walked willingly into whatever lay inside those walls, or if something had been waiting there all along, patient and certain, knowing she would come. Tell me, if it had been your mother, would you have gone inside? The days after the vanishing were not marked by loud grief, but by something quieter, heavier. In Brackley-on-Hill, sorrow was an old companion. It did not wail or claw. It settled like dust, clinging to everything. People went about their work, though slower. Doors shut earlier. The sound of laughter, once thin but present, vanished altogether. Lydia moved through those days with the numb steadiness of someone holding a fragile object inside her chest. She could not stop seeing her mother's seat at the kitchen table, the faint dent in the cushion where she had sat night after night. She feared that if she let grief fill her too quickly, it would swallow her whole, so she chose instead to begin with something she could hold in her hands. The records. The parish registry had stood in the same place for centuries, a narrow room behind the chapel vestry, lined with shelves that bowed under the weight of bound ledgers. Each leather spine bore a year in fading gold leaf, some so worn they could be read only by touch. The room smelled of dry paper and candle soot, and stepping into it was like entering a different air. Lydia carried a candle to the shelf where the most recent volume should have been. She found it quickly, 1842, the current year, and opened it to the last few months. What she saw first made her frown. The pages were neat and legible, baptisms, marriages, deaths, all written in the same fine script she recognized as belonging to Father Elric, but where the widow's names should have appeared. Each entry of their attendance at Mass, their small donations, their part in church matters. There was nothing, not blank spaces, but dark blotches. A strange resin hardened into a glossy film had been pressed over the parchment, blotting out entire lines. When Lydia scraped at one with her fingernail, it gave off a faint, acrid scent. The hardened smear did not flake away. It only dulled under pressure, as if the page itself had absorbed it. Her pulse quickened. She turned more pages, every widow's name, Every trace of their presence in the last year was sealed beneath the same black resin. It was as if someone had not only removed them from the present, but was trying to erase the proof they had ever existed at all. She wasn't alone in the room. A voice spoke from the shadow by the far shelf, low, rough, edged with a dry humor that did not quite fit the words. "You won't scrape it off," it said. Lydia turned, candlelight catching the lined face of an older man leaning on a cane. His coat was worn but neat, his boots dusty with the red-brown clay of the fields. Thaddeus Vale. He introduced himself, used to keep this place in order, before Elric came. He stepped forward, eyeing the blotches on the page. "That's not ink, miss, not tar, either. I've seen him make it. Smelled it burn in the brazier some nights. It's older than it looks." Lydia asked how he knew, and Thaddeus's gaze flicked toward the floor beneath their feet. "Because I've seen where he keeps the brazier," he said, "and I've seen him digging, down there, where the foundation's thicker than it ought to be." He told her of nights, long after the bell had gone still, when he had returned for tools he'd left behind and found Father Elric alone, coat off, sleeves rolled, lifting earth from a narrow pit beneath the altar. No one was allowed there, not even the sexton, and when Elric had caught sight of him, he had said nothing, simply fixed him with that still, unblinking gaze until Thaddeus had turned away. Thaddeus spoke of the ground under the chapel as though it were something alive, not the first building here, he said. "Beneath all this is the old hermitage, abandoned in the plague years. Some say it was never blessed proper after." The words left a chill in Lydia's chest. She thought of the damp altar cloth, the smell of seawater miles from the coast, and the resin sealing away names like a wound hidden beneath bandages. She began to look for something else, patterns, and soon she saw it. Each widow had lost a husband, yes, that was known. But as Lydia followed the faded records back, she found another thread. Each had also lost a child before the age of 7. Diphtheria, fever, accident, failure to thrive. The causes varied, but the end was the same. A grief doubled, sealed away behind veils and silent pews. She could not recall anyone in town ever speaking of it aloud. Outside, the wind pressed against the leaded glass windows. The candle flickered, guttered, then flared again. In the days that followed, the air in Brackley seemed to shift. A kind of quiet hysteria spread. Farmers found their livestock dead in the morning, bodies untouched, but tongues missing. Riverbank reeds moved in the stillness, swaying without wind, as though something beneath the surface brushed against their roots. And more than one villager swore they had seen shapes in the chapel's windows at night, silhouettes shifting behind the glass, though the doors had been locked since the night of the vigil. When Lydia passed the chapel now, she did not look too long. Not at the tower, not at the dark panes. She feared that if she met the gaze of whatever stood inside, it might recognize her. But she also feared something else that it already had. The desk was an heirloom of old oak, heavy enough to survive a century of dust and the small tempests of family life. It had belonged to her mother since before Lydia was born, and Lydia had never once seen it unlocked. The brass keyhole, worn to a faint oval, seemed less like a lock and more like an unblinking eye, patient in its watching. But now the key lay in Lydia's hand. It had been wrapped in an apron, folded deep among her mother's winter linens. Finding it felt like an intrusion, though she had done nothing yet but hold it. The weight of it was too deliberate, too personal, the kind of thing a person hides not because it is valuable, but because it is dangerous. The lock turned with the slow, metallic sigh of something too long unused. The scent that escaped was faint but distinct, paper that had drunk the years and ink that still remembered its purpose. Inside the top drawer, she found the bundle. Letters, perhaps 20, perhaps 30, bound with a strip of faded black ribbon. No address on the envelopes, no postmarks. When Lydia untied them, the paper whispered against itself like a conspirator shushing her. The handwriting was her mother's, unmistakable. The salutation on each one stopped Lydia's breath. "My beloved, though you are gone." She had prepared herself for grief, for longing, for words to a dead husband Lydia had barely known except through her mother's quiet devotion. But the first lines betrayed her expectation. "I saw you again by the altar. You looked as you did before the coughing took you. But your eyes were wet as though from rain. The widows were there, standing in their circle. They did not see me. They did not see you. I am certain they prayed, though the words were not their own. Lydia read another, and another. The letters were not mourning. They were confessions. Her mother wrote of dreams in which the widows' faces were pale as frost, their mouths moving in unison. They prayed a prayer they could not remember upon waking, a thing that slipped from the mind like water through a sieve, and yet, her mother wrote, she feared the prayer remained in them. Somewhere deeper than memory. Some letters hinted at unease, even guilt. Father Elric comes to us often now. He speaks softly, yet his words feel heavy. He says the chapel door must remain closed until the night it opens of its own will. I do not wish to return, and yet I always find myself there. Lydia's fingers trembled as she turned the pages. This was not the woman she knew, the mother who had lived a life of steady certainties, who measured her days in small kindnesses and the careful keeping of routine. This was a woman, afraid of herself. Later, Lydia carried the unease with her to the laundress's shop, where steam coiled from the pressing iron and the smell of soap clung to everything. Eliza, bent over her work, looked up only once when Lydia asked about the widows. They'd been meeting with Father Elric, she said, as though mentioning a fact Lydia ought to have known. Weeks before they were gone, always late, always quiet. Thought maybe it was prayer, thought maybe it wasn't. The words sat between them like damp linen, heavy, shapeless, impossible to ignore. That night, the house felt smaller. The lamplight seemed to press itself into corners, as though unwilling to illuminate more than it must. Lydia laid the letters back in their drawer, but did not lock it again. She had no appetite for supper. She sat by her window, listening to the wind worrying at the shutters. It was well past midnight when she heard the faint scuff of something against the floorboards. Outside her room, not the tread of footsteps, just one soft motion, deliberate. In the morning, she found it. A single piece of parchment slid beneath her door. No seal, no name, just 7 words. In an unfamiliar hand. Do not search for the chapel's door when it is shut. Search for it when it is gone. The rain had fallen all day, turning the streets into black mirrors, swallowing the light from every lantern. By the time Lydia left her narrow lane, her dress clung to her legs and her hair streamed against her cheeks, but she did not slow. The figure ahead, a pale silhouette half swallowed by the downpour, kept its pace, never glancing back, its outline too blurred to name. Rose Chapel loomed out of the storm like a memory half remembered. Yet where the great oaken doors should have been, there was only stone, blank, seamless, slick with moss that glistened in the lamplight. She reached out, fingertips brushing the wall. The chill of it bit deeper than the rain. She moved along the chapel's edge, boots sliding in the mud, until she reached the rear. There, impossibly, the door stood open. No hinges groaned. No footsteps marked the threshold. The interior was dim, shadows curling where the light should fall. The pews had been moved, not in neat rows, but into a warped spiral, like a shell, the altar at its heart. The air carried a weight, thick and sour, as if the walls had not breathed in years. Beneath the altar, the faint outline of a trapdoor beckoned. Her fingers brushed its edge, and the wood seemed to tremble under her touch. Then, a whisper. Not one voice, but many, speaking in a tongue she could not place, the syllables running like water over stone. A hand, ice-cold and unyielding, seized her wrist. She spun. Thaddeus's face, pale and rain-streaked. Not prayer, he said, pulling her toward the open night. That night, Lydia dreamed. 19 women, veiled in shadow, stepped into the river, heads bowed, hands clasped. Their feet never touched the water, and yet they vanished beneath it. The descent was not hurried. Thaddeus insisted on that. He claimed the stones beneath Rose Chapel shifted in their sleep if disturbed too quickly. A superstition Lydia might have dismissed a week ago, before she began to see the chapel as more than a crumbling relic. Now she obeyed without question, placing her feet where his lantern light revealed each narrow step, feeling the breath of the underground rise like a sigh through the centuries. Daylight still poured through the chapel's fractured stained glass above, but down here, its reach faltered. The colors faded into a dim wash of gray. Shadows lay in folds across the walls, like cloth left to rot in water. Somewhere above, a single note from the chapel's bell trembled into silence. Not the hour, but the weight of wind pressing against its rusted cradle. Lydia had been told the foundation was nothing more than mortar and stone, patched through the years, unworthy of superstition. Yet with each step, her certainty thinned. The walls were charred, not from recent flame. The blackness here was old, clinging not to the surface, but drawn into it, as though the fire had soaked through. She brushed her fingertips along the soot-darkened stone and felt no ash, only a strange smoothness, like the residue of oil long dried. "They burned something here," Thaddeus said quietly, his voice carrying without echo. Or someone, Lydia, said nothing. It was the carvings that stole her voice. They emerged along the passage without pattern, faceless women, their robes cascading like frozen water, their hands pressed flat against their chests. Where their faces should have been, there was only the suggestion of hollows, deep enough that even the lantern light could not reach the bottom. The figures were not decorative, they were warnings. Some stood alone, others crowded together, shoulder to shoulder, as if shielding what lay between them. Lydia found herself counting them, an impulse she could not name, until she reached 9. Always 9. In every stretch of wall, the faceless women appeared in sets of 9. They came at last into the chamber beneath the chapel's center, where the floor fell away into a wide, circular pit. Its stone rim was low, worn smooth, and set into it, like mortar, was a thin, brittle layer of black salt. Even unbroken, the salt seemed old, its edges soft as dust. The pit was dry. It was also deeper than the lantern could measure, swallowing light without a glimmer of stone at the bottom. Thaddeus circled the rim once, careful not to disturb the salt, and pointed toward an alcove almost hidden behind a slab of collapsed masonry. It was narrow enough that Lydia had to turn sideways to slip inside. The air here was colder, metallic. It held the scent of rain on iron. Though no water had touched these stones in generations, the alcove was small, no more than a niche carved by hand. Inside lay a book. It was weathered, its leather cover cracked to the grain, its spine softened to the curve of years. The pages, when she opened them, were the color of old honey and speckled with mold. The script was unlike anything she had ever seen. Tall, spidery letters braided together with symbols that might have been charms, or might have been wounds. Thaddeus leaned in, squinting. "No language I know, no language anyone here knows," Lydia murmured, though something in the looping letters made her uneasy, not because they were foreign, but because they felt close, as though she had seen their shapes in the corner of her eye before, in dreams that dissolved upon waking. She closed the book carefully, holding it to her chest. Above them, a sound broke the stillness, not the creak of wood or the sigh of wind, but the steady, muffled rhythm of footsteps crossing the chapel floor directly above the pit. Neither of them moved until the sound faded. That night Lydia sought the only man in town who might read what she could not. Dr. Oswin Hart lived at the edge of the southern marshes, in a house so smothered in ivy that from a distance it looked less like a dwelling than the skeleton of one. He was a scholar, though few knew in what. He had come to Rose Chapel's parish years ago with a library so vast it had to be carried in by wagon, and with the reputation of a man more at ease among paper than people. Hart answered the door himself, his hands ink-stained, his eyes sharp and restless. When Lydia placed the book upon his table, he looked at it for a long moment before opening it, as though it might vanish. Should he touch it too quickly? The first page drew from him a slow, measured breath. "This," he said, tracing the letters with one finger, "is an early form of Eldrick. It predates the town by centuries." Lydia leaned closer. "What does it say?" "It is not a single text," he said. "It is a record of rites. Plague era, by the look of it. These symbols," he pointed to the braided marks between the lines, "they are meant to seal grief into the earth." She frowned. Seal grief? Hart's eyes flicked up to hers to prevent it from spreading. There was a belief, in certain parts of the old country, that grief was not merely an emotion, but a sickness, a contagion, that could pass from the mourning to the living. Whole villages believed themselves doomed if grief was allowed to linger in the air too long. They buried it, along with the dead, and used rites such as these to bind it beneath the soil. She thought of the faceless women carved into the stone, the black salt around the pit. Hart turned another page, his expression tightening. "These women," he said slowly, "were not mourning, they were binding." There was no question in his voice, only certainty and a faint unease, as though the knowledge had brought with it a shadow. "What happens if the binding is broken?" Lydia asked. Hart shut the book. "Pray you do not learn the answer." When Lydia returned to the chapel the next morning, Father Elric was already at the pulpit. He had been a calm man once, his voice warm and steady, the kind that could carry a congregation through winter without losing their faith. Now there was a tremor in his hands as he gripped the wood, his eyes skimming the faces before him without settling. His sermon was not from Scripture, it was from memory, or perhaps from fear. He spoke of famine as if it were a thing that could walk through the streets at night, of hunger that had nothing to do with the body. "There will come a time," he said, his voice low but hard, "when grief itself will starve, when the earth will have no more sorrow to feed upon, and it will open its mouth for the living." No one breathed. Lydia felt the book's weight in her satchel like a heartbeat. She thought of the salt, the pit, the faceless women standing guard, with their hollow faces, and for the first time, she wondered whether Rose Chapel had been built to honor the dead, or to keep them in. The river that cut through Rose Chapel's valley had always been the color of dried blood. Generations of townsfolk swore it was the iron in the soil, the way it leached into the current. Others said it was the memory of something older, the water keeping its secrets the way the chapel kept its silence. But on a morning in late October, Lydia stood at its bank and saw it run clear for the first time in her life. No murk, no red haze drifting beneath the surface, only cold, glassy water reflecting the pale sky. The sight should have been beautiful, a sign of change, but her stomach turned instead. The river smelled wrong, too clean, too absent. The air over it felt hollow, stripped of something she had grown used to without knowing. She wasn't the only one who noticed. All along the bank, townsfolk gathered, murmuring as if afraid to raise their voices. Someone tossed a pebble into the current. It sank without trace. Another man dipped his hand in, then shook it, muttering that the water felt thin. It was the bank on the southern side that gave way first. The sound was like a sigh, long, low, and almost human, as the earth slumped toward the water. At first, it looked like the collapse of a normal embankment, but as the mud and roots tumbled away, shapes emerged. Pale shapes, bones, not the jagged scatter of accident or war, but row upon row, laid with deliberate care, and not men. The skulls that rolled into view were what little remained of black veils and mourning dresses, the fabric long rotted, but still clinging to their forms. Rings glinted on skeletal fingers, brooches, dull with age, clung to bony throats. One woman screamed, another crossed herself and fled. But Lydia stepped forward, her breath catching in her chest. She told herself she was looking for clues, for patterns, that she was here as an observer, not a mourner. It was then she saw the wax. Each skull bore the same mark, its mouth sealed with a thick, black plug. Not tar, not earth, wax, hardened, unbroken, as if whoever placed it there had wanted silence to last beyond death. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of the river away, replacing it with something older, the faintest trace of burnt herbs and tallow. Someone to her right whispered the word sacrifice. Another muttered about the old curse. Lydia tried to ignore them until her gaze fell on one pale hand half buried in the silt. The skin was long gone, but the ring was intact, its stone a deep garnet, set in an unusual, twisting band. She knew it instantly. It was her mother's. Her breath faltered. Her first thought was impossibility. Her mother had died only a year ago. These bones were centuries old, the wax hardened into an age that could not be faked. But her fingers itched to touch the ring all the same. She didn't. Something deep in her, the same instinct that kept her from stepping too close to the pulpit's hidden door, told her not to disturb it. By afternoon, the banks along 3 more bends of the river had crumbled. The sheriff ordered the area roped off, but panic moved faster than rope could be strung. The town square filled with rumors that the widows of Rose Chapel had been killed to renew a vow. that the clear water meant the vow had run its course, and now something hungrier would wake, that the 13 tolls would return. Lydia kept mostly silent, though her mind worked furiously. Thaddeus was nowhere to be seen, the last time she had spoken to him. His eyes had carried that strange, fever-bright certainty. "I think I know how to follow where they went," he'd told her, leaning close, his voice low as though the air might carry it to ears it shouldn't. She had asked him who they were, and he had only smiled, not cruelly, but as if pitying her for not yet knowing. Now, the chapel's shadow stretched long across the square as dusk drew near. That was when the bells began. At first, Lydia thought it was only the hour, but the sound didn't stop at 6 or 7. It rolled on, slow, deliberate tolls that seemed to grow heavier with each strike. The town froze. Even the dogs stopped barking. 8, 9, 10. No one moved. 11, 12. The pause before the last was long enough to convince her it was over. But then it came, a 13th toll, deep enough that she felt it in her ribs. No one was in the belfry. She was sure of it. She'd been staring at it the whole time. That night, Lydia did not sleep easily. When sleep finally took her, it was not the drifting, harmless kind. She woke, or thought she woke, to find her room thick with shadow. The edges of the furniture melting into the dark. At the foot of her bed stood her mother, not as she had been in life, but impossibly still, her face pale and waxen, her mouth sewn shut with coarse black thread. The garnet ring gleamed faintly on her finger. Her mother's hands reached out, not grasping, not clawing, but open, palms up, as though begging Lydia to lead her somewhere she could not go alone. The room held no sound, no wind, only the heavy pull of that gaze. When Lydia tried to speak, the air in her throat felt as though it had turned to wax as well. The town had always been small, but now it felt hollowed out, like the shell of a creature that had long since fled. Houses that once glowed with lamplight now stood dark, their windows gaping like broken teeth in the moonlight. Yards went untended, doors hung slightly ajar, and shutters rattled loosely in the late autumn wind. The scent of burning wood drifted faintly through the air, but it carried no comfort, only the acrid tang of fear, as though every chimney still smoking was counting down its final nights before the family inside abandoned it for good. It was said that once the first family left, others would follow. Fear, in a place like Rose Chapel, moved like a sickness. One whisper at a market, one hurried glance over a shoulder, one unexplained absence, and the entire town seemed to catch it. Lydia had been away from her own home for most of the day, moving from one errand to the next, not because they needed doing, but because she could not bear the thought of sitting still. She had returned to find her mother in the kitchen, pale and distracted, her fingers tapping the edge of the table in some private rhythm. The moment Lydia stepped inside, her mother's eyes flicked toward the clock, then away, as though she had been waiting for something or someone. It was not until an hour later that the news came. Mrs. Penwell, whose shop still clung to life on the far side of Town Square, had been the one to tell her. She leaned across her counter, her voice low but her eyes bright with the relish of having something terrible to share. "Thaddeus went in," she whispered, "alone. Last night. He hasn't been seen since." Lydia had stared at her for a long moment, as though waiting for the rest of the story, the part where he came back, the part where it had all been a mistake. But Mrs. Penwell simply shook her head, her mouth set in a tight line that suggested both satisfaction and dread. It made no sense. Thaddeus had been cautious to the point of paranoia. He had been the one who told her never to go near the trapdoor, the one who claimed he could smell when trouble was about to break through the skin of the world. And yet he had gone down there, by choice, by himself, and the earth had swallowed him whole. The knowledge pressed on her like the weight of a deep, cold river. She could have turned away. She could have let the darkness take him and told herself that it was simply the way of things here. But the thought of doing nothing made her feel hollow, and she could not bear to join the rest of the town in its slow retreat into silence. That night, she returned to the chapel. It was colder than it had been the evening before, the wind carrying the sharp bite of winter in its teeth. The chapel's silhouette rose ahead of her, its steeple a black spike against the silver wash of the moon. The windows were dark, no lanterns burned inside, Her footsteps echoed faintly on the stone path, the sound oddly magnified in the empty air. She carried the stolen key in her pocket, its metal chilled through, a tiny anchor against the surging current of her thoughts. Inside, the chapel smelled of damp stone and something faintly metallic, a smell she had noticed before, but could never name. Dust floated in thin streams of moonlight that slipped between warped boards and loose panes. The trapdoor was there, behind the pulpit. At least, it was when she glanced at it from the corner of her eye. When she looked directly, it was gone. This, she knew by now, was its way. It preferred to exist only in doubt, in the periphery of belief. She forced herself to look away, to let her gaze slide past the altar, and then, without breaking her stride, she stepped toward it. Her boot struck wood instead of stone. The key turned in the lock, with a slow, grinding reluctance, as though the mechanism inside had grown used to its long rest. The hinges groaned when she lifted the door, the sound oddly muffled, as if the air beneath swallowed it before it could rise. The steps descended into darkness. She had brought a lantern, but its flame seemed reluctant to grow, flickering low and dim even after several attempts. The wooden stairs creaked beneath her weight, the sound vanishing into the shadows below. The air grew colder with each step, the kind of cold that seeped into her bones, heavier and more ancient than winter. At the bottom, the ground sloped downward. The tunnel was narrow, the walls close enough that her shoulders brushed against them. The stone was slick beneath her fingers, as though some unseen moisture had seeped through for years without ever drying. Her lantern light caught strange shapes on the walls, shallow indentations, arranged unevenly at first, then with greater purpose. She stopped and held the lantern higher. Handprints. 19 of them. Each one was pressed deep into the stone, fingers splayed, palms flat, as though whoever made them had done so with desperate force. She traced one with her fingertips. It was cold, colder even than the surrounding stone, and it felt as though the chill clung to her skin. The slope carried her lower, the sound of her own footsteps swallowed by the damp air. She could hear something faint ahead, a slow, steady rhythm, not unlike the beating of a heart. It was soft at first, so faint she thought it might be her own pulse echoing in her ears. But the deeper she went, the stronger it became, resonating faintly through the soles of her boots. The tunnel ended in a chamber. Its walls were covered in carvings. She stepped closer and realized they were names, each one etched deep, the letters sharp and deliberate despite their age. They were all women's names, all widows, and beside each name a date. She ran her fingers over one at random, feeling the grooves cut into the stone. The dates were not of the past, they were all in the future. Her gaze caught on the last name, her mother's. The date beside it was less than a week away. Something in the air shifted. The steady heartbeat she had heard in the tunnel was louder now, though it seemed to come not from any one place but from the stone itself. She turned in a slow circle, the lantern trembling in her hand, the shadows stretching and swaying around her as though drawn toward her movement. The sound deepened. It was no longer merely a heartbeat. It was layered now, like many hearts, beating together, their rhythms aligned into something slow and terrible. The lantern flickered once, twice, and then the flame grew unnaturally still, frozen in the glass as though time had paused around it. Lydia took a step back. The air thickened, pressing against her skin, filling her lungs with something heavy and metallic. She turned toward the tunnel. It was gone, where the archway had been. There was now only smooth stone. She stumbled forward, pressing her hands against it, but it was solid, unbroken. Her palms left faint marks of moisture on the cold surface, the way breath fogs glass. The heartbeat filled her skull now, its rhythm matching the pounding of her own chest. And then, from behind her, a sound. It was not a footstep, not exactly. More like the slow scrape of something heavy shifting across the floor. She turned. The walls of the chamber seemed closer than before, as though the room itself had drawn breath and leaned inward. The names shimmered faintly, the carved letters darkening, filling with a deep, glistening red. Her mother's name was brightest of all. The date beside it pulsed in time with the heartbeat. The sound grew louder, almost unbearable now, each beat sending a tremor through the stone beneath her feet. She clutched the lantern tighter. Though it felt useless in the pressing dark, Her breath came shallow, the metallic tang coating her tongue, and then she saw it in the far corner, where shadow pooled thickest. Something shifted. A figure, or the memory of one, peeled itself away from the wall. It did not move like a living thing. It stretched, unfolded, its form both too tall and too thin, the edges of it fraying into the air. The sound in the stone was no longer just a heartbeat. It was a voice now, too low to be understood, but deep enough to make the floor vibrate beneath her boots. She took a step back. The figure took a step forward. The lantern light trembled against the carved names, throwing long, slanting shadows across the chamber. The air pressed tighter, like hands against her chest, and then, without warning, the lantern went out. The heartbeat and the voice were the only things left. Somewhere in the dark, the sound of stone shifting, and then, behind her, the soft, unmistakable sound of a door closing. The first thing Lydia felt was the cold, not the damp, creeping chill of stone walls underground, but the soft, almost tender coolness of early morning air on her skin. She opened her eyes to a gray sky brushed with the faintest thread of rose, the kind of dawn that seemed hesitant to arrive, as if it too feared what the day might bring. She was lying on her side in a bed of tall, glistening grass. The blades bent and swayed gently with the wind, each droplet of dew catching the dim light like a bead of glass. Her breath came ragged, her limbs trembling not from exhaustion alone, but from the memory of the last thing she'd seen in the depths of Rose Chapel, the carved names, the dates, her mother's name, the heartbeat in stone. But now, the chapel was gone. Where its shadow should have fallen, there was nothing but open fields stretching toward the riverbend. No splintered beams, no cracked foundation, not even the faintest depression in the earth to suggest that something had once stood there. For nearly 2 centuries, the air carried no trace of dust or age, only the clean, sharp scent of wet grass, and the quiet hum of insects beginning their morning song. Her fingers dug into the soil, half expecting it to yield some secret, a corner of buried stone, a bone, a key, but there was nothing, only earth. A voice startled her. "You shouldn't linger here." She turned sharply to see Dr. Hart standing, a short distance away. His coat was buttoned, his gloved hands resting lightly atop a cane he did not need. His face was pale, more drawn than she'd ever seen it, as though he had spent the night awake, listening for footsteps that never came. "Where is it?" Lydia's voice was unsteady. "The chapel, where did it go?" He took a long breath. Before answering, "It hasn't gone. Not entirely. What you're looking at is a space emptied, not erased." She blinked, her frustration rising. "You're speaking in riddles. I was inside, Hart. I saw." She stopped herself, the images, to give voice to. His eyes flicked toward the horizon, as if checking for something only he could see. "What you experienced," he said slowly, "was the threshold before the hollow day. The chapel has entered its turning. The turning, it's an old word," Hart explained. "Stepping closer, a structure bound to a place by sorrow, or vow doesn't simply collapse or rot. When its tether begins to fray, it passes into another state, a hollow day, when the veil between loss and return is thinnest. It may remain gone for hours, days, sometimes longer, but its absence doesn't mean safety." Lydia stared at the empty field. "You mean it'll come back?" He nodded. "And when it does, so will what's inside." Her pulse quickened. "The names, the dates, Hart. My mother's." His expression darkened. "I know." The silence between them was heavy. Lydia could hear her own breathing, the wet rustle of the grass as the wind shifted. She felt as though she had stepped out of time, out of everything familiar, into some ancient rhythm that had been turning long before she was born. Hart finally said, "You should leave before nightfall. The hollow day is not a gift, it's a warning." But Lydia couldn't leave, not while her mother's name was carved into the walls of a place that should not exist, not when she'd seen the date, less than a week away. Every instinct screamed that running would only hasten what the chapel had already claimed. That night, clouds rolled low and heavy over the field. The air was damp, pressing against her skin like the weight of unseen hands. Lydia returned, drawn by something she could not name. The field was silent when she arrived, silent. No wind, no insects, even the distant rush of the river was gone. As though the sound had been swallowed, the grass seemed taller now, its tips brushing against her waist, heavy with moisture that clung to her clothes. And then they appeared. 19. Figures pale and dim against the darkened field. The widows. They moved in a slow, unbroken circle, the hem of their long gowns trailing through the wet grass. Their faces were blurred, as if seen through a veil of water, each feature soft and indistinct, but their heads were tilted downward, their steps perfectly in sync, their presence almost humming. The air around them shimmered faintly, as though lit by a light just beyond sight. Lydia could feel it in her chest, a quiet vibration, the same slow, rhythmic beat she had heard in the chamber below the chapel. She stepped forward without realizing she'd moved. "Mother," she called softly. The figures did not stop. She took another step, her shoes sinking slightly into the damp soil. "Mother, it's me, it's Lydia." This time, something shifted. The circle's movement slowed, the sound in the air deepening into a low, pulsing thrum. And then all 19 women turned toward her at once. The movement was silent, fluid, unnatural. No breath, no shuffle of feet, only the sudden, unified stillness of their bodies facing her. Their blurred faces tilted upward, but not enough for her to see their eyes. The field seemed to contract around her, the space between each blade of grass narrowing, the air thickening in her lungs. Lydia's heart pounded. She felt as though she had spoken too loudly in a cathedral, her voice breaking some sacred hush she did not understand. She tried to speak again, but the words caught in her throat. The widows' heads turned slightly, like a single creature, listening for a sound only they could hear. Then all movement ceased. The wind did not stir. The grass did not sway. Even the mist hanging above the field froze, each droplet suspended in the air. The night itself seemed to hold its breath. Lydia could hear nothing but her own heartbeat, fast, wild, too loud in the silence. And somewhere within that stillness, she knew the hollow day had not ended. It had only begun. The chapel bell had not tolled since the night the widows vanished. Lydia stood at the threshold, her hand upon the warped oak door, feeling its grain tremble faintly under her palm, as though it still remembered the vibrations of something vast and voiceless within. She had not intended to come here. Her feet had carried her through the crooked lanes of town without decision, led by a dread she could not name. It was the same dread that had filled her lungs in the field of morning dew when the chapel had been gone, the same dread that had coiled around her spine when the widows turned toward her in that impossible silence. Inside, the air was cold and close, heavy with the scent of stone that had never fully dried. Candles guttered at the altar, their light feeble and uneven, throwing shadows like crooked fingers across the cracked plaster walls. Father Elric stood near the pulpit, his head bent, hands folded. He looked older than she remembered, though it had been only days since she'd last seen him. His robe hung loose on his frame, the fabric rumpled as though he had slept in it. She closed the door behind her with a dull thud that made him start. His eyes found hers, and for a moment there was something like relief in them, quickly smothered. Beneath caution, "I need you to tell me the truth," she said. The words emerged with more steel than she felt. His brow furrowed. "The truth? No more half answers. No more riddles. I want to know what this place is, what it's always been. I saw the field, Father. I saw the widows." The silence that followed was not hesitation, but the careful gathering of weight. He moved toward her slowly, his hands clasped before him. His voice, when it came, was low and deliberate. "This chapel," he said, "was never built for worship." The sentence fell like a stone into still water, sending slow, widening ripples through her. She blinked at him. "Then what?" "It was a seal," he continued, "and nothing more. A mark upon the earth to hold what should not walk it." He stopped beside one of the side pews, resting his fingers on its back as if steadying himself. "Do you know who the widows were, Lydia?" She swallowed. They prayed here. They cared for the place. They kept it." His voice sharpened slightly, like a knife drawn against whetstone. "Not by faith, but by loss. Every woman you saw had been chosen because she had already given something to the thing that waits beneath us." Her skin prickled. "Chosen? By who?" "By grief itself." The words sounded mad, yet there was no tremor of uncertainty in them. He went on before she could speak. There's a hunger in this world that does not consume flesh or bone. It does not burn or rot or tear. It takes only sorrow, but it takes it utterly, until the one who mourns is no longer a person at all, until they are hollow enough for it to live in. Lydia's breath caught. You mean? They were vessels, he said, his gaze fixed on the candle flames. Each widow carried part of that hunger, locked within the marrow of her grief. So long as they lived and bore it, the thing could not leave the chapel grounds. They bound it without knowing its name, without speaking to it, without ever daring to look too closely. A shiver threaded through her, and my mother, his eyes flickered toward her, and she saw in them the quiet ruin of a man who had spent too long, holding back a tide. She was the last to be chosen. She took her place when the binding faltered. The pews creaked faintly as Lydia gripped the edge of one, her knuckles white. What do you mean? Faltered. He drew a slow breath, as though the air itself resisted. The ritual is called the turning. It happens once in a span. When the hunger begins to stir, the keepers walk the circle through the night, each step an unspoken vow, each breath a seal upon the dark. At dawn, the thing sleeps again, its appetite lulled by the weight of their grief. But the last turning failed. The words seemed to echo against the stone. They tried, he said, but the circle broke before the sun rose. One was taken before her vow was complete. The hunger tasted release, and it did not forget. Lydia felt her stomach knot, so it came for the others. One by one, Elric murmured, as if it had always known the shape of their footsteps. And now it seeps out. It listens in the weeping of the bereaved, in the silence of empty rooms, in the cold at the foot of a bed where someone once slept. It has patience, Lydia, and a hunger that will not stop at the chapel door. She thought of the quiet houses in town, of the women who no longer met her eyes, of the way even the air seemed to carry the taste of loss lately. She thought of her own chest, tight with the ache of her mother's absence. Her voice was barely above a whisper. You're saying it will take the whole town. If the turning is not renewed, he said, it will take everything. And you. He stopped, the muscles in his jaw working. You have already called to it, whether you meant to or not. A flush of cold spread down her spine. How? You stepped into the circle. You spoke in the field. You called for her. His eyes were steady on hers now, unblinking, and it hurt you. The weight of his words pressed against her until she could hardly breathe. So what happens now? His gaze dropped to the floor, where the flagstones were worn smooth by centuries of unseen passage. Now, he said quietly, you decide if you will stand in the circle when the night comes, if you will keep the vow your mother carried, or if you will let the hunger find you, and through you, the rest of us. For a moment neither moved. The candles hissed faintly in their wax, and beyond the walls the wind shifted, carrying with it a scent like damp earth. Lydia felt the ground tilt under her feet, though she knew it was only her own heartbeat surging in her ears. If I do this, she said slowly, will it end? His answer was not what she hoped for. It will sleep, and when it wakes again. His eyes closed briefly, as if in prayer. Then another will take your place. Her hands curled into fists at her sides. She thought of the 19 blurred faces in the field, of the unbroken circle they had formed until she had stepped forward. She thought of the way they had turned toward her in perfect unison, as though marking her. A part of her wanted to turn away, to let the curse spill out and drown this tired shadow town. But beneath that was a deeper knowing that the hunger would not be satisfied until it had hollowed her too, whether she stood against it or not. When she spoke again, her voice was quiet but without tremor. Tell me what I need to do. Father Elric's eyes opened. For the first time since she'd entered, they held something other than weariness, a dim light, fragile but unbroken. You will not stand alone, he said, but you must be willing to give more than your grief. You must give the shape of yourself. The hunger cannot feed on what it does not know. You must let it know you. Lydia's throat tightened. And if I can't, then it will take you anyway. The truth lay between them, heavy as the stones beneath their feet. Somewhere far off, the bell that had not tolled in days gave a single hollow note, though no rope had been touched. It was not courage that brought Lydia back to Rose Chapel that night, but inevitability. The streets of Milltown lay drowned in fog. The lamps a long lantern rose smoldering in pale halos. that dissolved before they could pierce the dark. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing into her bones. Each step toward the chapel another stitch pulled from the life she had known. Behind her, the town slept, or pretended to. No one watched from the windows. But Lydia felt the unseen gaze of generations, the kind that turned away not from ignorance, but from the fear of recognizing what was owed. The chapel waited where it had always stood, crooked and black against the drifting white, its doors yawning open as though it had been expecting her. She did not knock. The air inside was colder than the night, carrying the smell of iron and the faint sweetness of long wilted flowers. The pews were empty, save for the 19 women standing in a crescent. Near the altar, they did not greet her. Their faces, lined and hollow, were unreadable, though in the glassy eyes of the eldest, she thought she saw something like pity. Each wore black, but not the mourning black of fresh loss. Theirs was the deep, unreflective black of garments that had been worn only for this one night each year, and for no other reason. Father Elric stepped forward. His hands trembled around the rusted key he held, though whether from age or dread, Lydia could not tell. "It will ask for more than you think," he murmured. Lydia met his gaze. "It has already taken everything." The priest's mouth tightened, and he turned toward the pulpit. Behind it, the wood was unremarkable to the eye, but Lydia knew, as he did, that there was a door there when the chapel wished it. Tonight, it stood open, the darkness behind it thick and wet, like the breath of something that had been sleeping for centuries. One by one, the 19 women passed through. Lydia followed, the cold swallowing her whole. The air grew heavy, muffling the sound of her boots on the narrow, stone-sloped corridor. The walls sweated brine. She ran her fingertips along them and felt the sting of salt. Somewhere far below, water dripped in an endless rhythm. The passage opened into a vast, circular chamber, the pit. Its walls were crusted with thick white lines of salt, its floor a sunken ring that seemed to drink in the lamplight. In the center, a shallow basin of black stone waited, older than the chapel, older than the town itself. Lydia had the sensation of standing at the lip of a mouth that had been pried shut for too long. The women formed a ring around the basin. When Lydia stepped into place, she felt the weight of their joined hands, the cool, dry skin against hers. The air vibrated with a silence so taut it seemed to bow beneath its own strain. Then the chant began. The words were not in any language Lydia knew, but they rolled through her bones with the familiarity of a lullaby she could not remember learning. The voices rose together, 19 threads weaving into a rope meant to bind. She felt the ground shift underfoot, as though something beneath them had stirred at the sound. At first, it was only the ache of memory, her mother's voice, her mother's hands, the smell of lavender on her clothes, slipping like water between her fingers. Then came the sharp pull, a hollowing inside her chest that made her gasp. It was not pain, not exactly. It was subtraction. Pieces of her life, warm and human, were being unstitched and fed to the air around her. She thought she heard her mother's laughter once, bright and sudden. Before it cracked and faded into nothing, she tried to hold onto it, but the chant grew louder, the pull more insistent. It did not want joy, it wanted loss. The basin at the center began to fill, though no hand poured into it. What gathered there was not water, but a darkness so deep it reflected nothing at all. The chant reached a keening pitch, and Lydia understood. The hunger was here. It had no form, but it had weight, a pressure against her ribs, a whisper in her skull that it wanted to be known. It wanted to be fed. Her knees buckled, but the hands, holding hers, tightened, steadying her in the circle. She saw the faces of the other women blur, their edges softening as if smoke had begun to rise from their skin. They did not resist. Their eyes were closed, mouths still moving in the rhythm of the chant. Even as their bodies thinned and paled, the darkness in the basin rift, pressing against the invisible walls that held it. Lydia felt it reach for her, pressing its cold weight against her mind. She knew what it demanded. To keep it bound, she would have to give more than memory. She would have to give herself. The final verse began. The air was thick enough to choke, the salt burning her eyes. She felt her own form beginning to fray, her hands losing shape where they touched the others. Somewhere deep inside, the last image of her mother, the one she had hidden from the pull, surfaced, her standing in the chapel doorway years ago. The bells tolling 13 times, her face unreadable in the dark. Lydia let it go. The basin split with a sound like ice fracturing, but instead of spilling outward, the darkness collapsed inward, folding into itself until there was nothing left but the stone. The chamber shook, dust raining from the ceiling, the salt walls flaring white for a heartbeat before dimming again. When Lydia looked around, the circle was gone. No hands held hers. No women stood where they had been. Only 19 small heaps of ash marked their places. The chant had ended. The hunger was bound again. She stepped toward the basin. The black stone was cold under her fingers, but there was no pulse within it now. In its stillness, she understood the truth. She had not survived the ritual. When she turned to leave, her feet found the corridor without thought. The climb upward was slow, the air growing warmer as she rose. She emerged into the chapel, its pews in perfect order, the dust undisturbed. Outside, the first light of morning was stretching thin across the fog. Rose Chapel stood whole and silent, as though nothing had happened. But Lydia was not in the street, not in the town, not in the world she had known. In the parish records, a new name was etched in black resin: Lydia Finch, keeper of the binding. The ink was darker than the others, its edges glistening like fresh tar. And in the deepest nights that followed, when the fog lay heavy over Milltown and the air pressed damp against the skin, the bells of Rose Chapel tolled 13 times again. No one dared to count aloud, but everyone heard.